Should you be keeping an aquarium at home? Let's talk about that. Hello, my name is Harris Bard and I am here for Pond Life Aquatics, currently filming in my bedroom at home where I am keeping 2 fish tanks and will very shortly probably be keeping many more. In today's video, we're going to be discussing some of the pros of keeping an aquarium and why I personally think many more people should be keeping them, and some of the cons and why some people probably shouldn't be keeping them at all. Why should you keep an aquarium? Well, for me personally, I think it's one of the most fun things you can keep for a hobby. I think building something that's beautiful and full of nature and brings life into a home or workspace is genuinely one of the most rewarding things anyone can do, and I've been doing it since I was about 6 years old. It's also an incredibly rewarding hobby where you can watch something that you've created develop over time. Even more than that, you get to keep fish, which, hey, we built an entire business around that, so enough said. On a more serious note, keeping fish, particularly for young kids, because I've been keeping them since I was 6, I found it taught me a lot about structuring my day, and also taught me a lot about life and death and cycles and taking care of another living thing. So that's something to definitely consider when thinking about whether you should start an aquarium. Plus, they're just beautiful things to have in a home. I get to wake up every day and look at 2 aquariums, which I've worked really hard on, and I think personally look really beautiful and have changed so much throughout the years. They're never the same. I get to look at some beautiful fish and it really brightens my day. Now, that being said, there are some definite reasons why you shouldn't be keeping an aquarium. The first one, which seems a bit icky to talk about, is the money thing. Aquariums aren't the cheapest hobby, although they can be done on the cheap. I've definitely done aquariums in the past where I've spent well under £50 on secondhand glass boxes with old lights, and then slowly built up my plants by taking cuttings or secondhand plants from people I've known. But realistically, if you're looking at this video, you're probably thinking about buying a new aquarium and setting up from scratch. And in my experience, an aquarium worth keeping that's gonna give whatever pet you decide to keep in them a good quality of life, realistically, you're looking between about £100+ pounds. I've seen first aquariums go up to £500–600. I know professional aquariums that have gone up into the thousands, tens of thousands in some cases. It's also an ongoing outlay. People think that once the aquarium is first set up, then they can just leave it alone. But obviously you've got to take into account, you have chemicals that you need to add to your aquariums, unless you're going for a completely bioactive, non-anything sort of aquarium, but that's an entirely different thing. I wouldn't recommend that for a beginner. And there's fish foods, which obviously isn't that expensive in the beginning, but it adds up over time. It is going to be an ongoing outlay throughout your fish keeping and aquarium keeping process. More than that, it's also very common, for me at least, to underestimate how much an aquarium is going to cost you. I start out with an idea that something is going to be super cheap and I'm going to go for something low budget. But then I catch sight of a beautiful plant that requires a better light, and then you get into that, and then you decide to keep CO2. So money is always going to be a factor in aquarium keeping, which I wish it wasn't. I wish everyone could just have an aquarium for free, because I think they're the best thing ever. But it is something to consider. The next thing to consider is space. I'm more than willing to sacrifice movement space for aquarium space. I've had these aquariums on the left-hand side of my bed. I literally sleep about 3 feet away from them at any given time. My best friend sleeps with his aquarium at the foot of his bed. But it is something to be considered when you think that you can't actually move around your space as easily as you could because you've got a big glass box in it. This can be easily avoided by keeping smaller aquariums, but beginner fish tanks, seemingly counterintuitively, are better to be kept larger than smaller. That's mainly because when you keep a larger aquarium, things go wrong a lot slower than when you keep things in a small space. For example, if you're keeping a, let's say, 120-litre tank, if the water quality starts to go off, it's not good, but it will go off slower than if you have a 15-litre shrimp tank. In the 15-litre shrimp tank, things can escalate really quickly and you can suffer an entire wipeout in the space of a night. Where in the 120-litre, although it's still not a big aquarium, you're much less likely to suffer wipeouts than you are in smaller aquariums. Another thing to consider, and this is more for people who have kids, is that 9 times out of 10, probably more like 99 times out of 100, you are going to suffer some kind of death in your first time keeping an aquarium. Aquariums are much easier to keep now, even more so than when I was a kid, but hey, everything's a learning curve. When you first start a hobby, you can't expect yourself to be the best in the world at it. And even professional fish keepers are going to suffer losses when moving fish to a new aquarium, whether that's because of new tank syndrome or just sometimes fish don't like being moved. I'm currently keeping a whole shoal of rummy nose, and yes, they're an easy fish to keep, but rummy nose don't like being moved. They get very stressed. Sometimes they can just keel over. I was very lucky where when I added my 14 into my 70-litre over there, I didn't really have any issues, but I know people who've added the same amount of rummy nose to a bigger aquarium and they've just not liked the moved and developed something like ick and they die. For adults, that's something that we can kind of deal with and we know that death is a part of life, but if for kids, I've seen kids get really upset when they see something die, and it's not a nice thing to have to experience, and I imagine as a parent, it's really not a nice thing to experience at all. The only other thing that's really springing to mind in terms of cons of keeping an aquarium is the time outlay. Not just the time outlay of setting up the aquarium to begin with, which in my experience can take anywhere from between an hour for a small fish tank if you're going to aquascape it well, or I've spent 8 hours on a client's fish tank before where I was hand building the scape from scratch, and it just takes time. There's a reason why people pay for aquariums to be set up. It is a skill and it takes time to set them up in the beginning. More than that, maintenance takes time. It's one of those things when you think that you just need to do a water change on an aquarium, but then you notice that there's a little bit of browning on one of your plants, you start cutting back, which makes you notice that there's a little bit of silt going on, so then you start vacuuming out more, which means that you end up spending hours and hours maintaining a tank that you thought was going to take 10 minutes to do a water change on that week. Maybe that's just me being really terrible at time management, but personally, I enjoy it. It doesn't feel like a chore for me to have to maintain my fish tanks. I schedule it in every Sunday where I do my water changes. Then one weekend of the month, I do all of my filters where I'll clean the media in tank water. I'll do an entire video on that, but it is a time-consuming process, as is any hobby. But I think sometimes when people see these amazing looking fish tanks online, they think that not that much time goes into them and you can just leave them alone, which a lot of the time people do. They just don't see the hours of work that go into pruning plants, making sure that your fish don't get sick, feeding your fish, all that kind of thing. Now, if you've listened to the pros and cons and you've decided that keeping an aquarium is the definite way to go, I'll talk about this more in future videos, but the thing I would consider is, where are you going to put it? Make sure you have a space that's free from any severe traffic. I mean spaces that are going to have heavy objects carried through them. Like, don't have them in doorways. Make sure they're in a space that they can be enjoyed, where they're relaxed. You don't want them in front of windows. You don't want them in front of radiators. I'll go through videos of this in the future, but this is just something to consider. And then just remember, have fun. Try and make something that's beautiful, that brings nature into your home, and that makes you happy, because that's the only reason anyone really keeps aquariums in the first place. My name is Harris Bard. I'm here for Life Aquatics. If you've liked this video, then drop me a comment below telling me if you are keeping an aquarium at the moment, or if you're deciding whether or not you should keep one. Tell me if I've missed out any pros or cons of keeping an aquarium, and if you need anything for your aquarium, check out our website below. If you're in the London area, come see our store. It's in Northwest London, NW7 1AS, 1 Finchley Nurseries. And remember, keep enjoying your fish. Keep enjoying aquascaping. I'll see you on the next one.